Good afternoon. The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony regarding the implementation and future of DHS's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, program. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. In providing effective cybersecurity, the ability of the federal enterprise to monitor and assess the vulnerabilities and threats to its networks and systems in real time or as near real time as possible is paramount. This is what the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, program at DHS is all about. Understanding what and who is on federal networks so that we can achieve true visibility into the federal government's digital ecosystem. Phase 1 of CDM is to provide visibility into federal networks and information systems by working to identify what was on federal networks. It was a simple question, really. What hardware and software was on the systems an agency or department was running? This was about taking stock of those internet-connected assets. And as DHS has moved through Phase 1, they found an incredible amount of devices connected to our networks that agencies were not previously aware of. How can you protect what you can't see? How can you modernize your technology if you don't even know what technology you have? It's no secret that the government has trouble buying technology. Old and outdated technology is not only a barrier to the federal government completing its mission to serve the American people in a digital world, but brings with it insecurities and raises serious cybersecurity risks for each and every agency and department. DHS began Phase 1 in 2012. While I understand that setting up new government programs, buying new and advanced technologies, and deploying those technologies across a massive federal environment is not easy, the threats to federal agencies, however, continue to grow every minute. The maturity of the Continuing Diagnostics and Mitigation program has to move at the pace of new technologies and innovations, not at the pace of bureaucracy. To most effectively carry out oversight, we must educate ourselves. While DHS is working with 70-plus federal agencies and departments, from the 24 CFO Act agencies down to dozens of smaller bureaus and offices, this committee must work to better understand the pace at which cybersecurity technologies are advancing and how programs like CDM are working to protect the .gov. Does DHS have access to the cybersecurity platforms, technologies, and services necessary to make effective continuous monitoring a reality in 5 years, not in 15 years? We must work with the experts leading these charges in the private sector to find ways for more agile adoption of the tools and services we need to defend our networks and our data. As we have seen with both the private sector and government data breaches, the identities and privacies of millions of real Americans are at risk here. The federal government must work to protect the data of these citizens, including the employees that work within. That's why we're here today, to learn what we are doing right and to learn what we could be doing better. And to a certain extent, what does success look like? The rapidly evolving threat landscape of modern information age means that the government must change its processes to ensure that we aren't gathering more data than we can really protect. As we continue this conversation, I look forward to hearing from stakeholders throughout the federal IT space, including technology companies, DHS, and the federal agencies that they serve. We begin with the private sector experts joining us today. CDM is an ambitious program that I believe, if implemented well and over a reasonable timeline, provides the American people with the kind of federal cybersecurity defense that they deserve. I want to thank the witnesses for their time, and I look forward to their testimony today. I now recognize the ranking minority member, Mr. Richmond, for any opening statement that he might have.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Chairman Ratcliffe for today's hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, CDM. Today, DHS is working to protect federal networks by administering two signature programs, Einstein and CDM. These programs work in tandem to keep out unauthorized traffic and provide ongoing monitoring and mitigation of cybersecurity risk. Through CDM, the department works with federal agencies to procure cybersecurity tools and services to empower them to fend off cyber attacks. As initially envisioned, CDM would provide each agency with the information and tools necessary to protect its network by, among other things, identifying the assets on the agency's network that warrant protection, bolstering access controls to various elements of an agency's network, and improving situational awareness about activities on an agency's network. Implementation of CDM, however, has been slower than DHS originally anticipated. Challenges inherent to the size and scope of the task of accounting for all assets on the federal network, confusion about whether DHS or a customer agency was responsible for footing the bill for CDM-related expenses, and technology gaps in the commercial off-the-shelf markets have collectively slowed the process. That said, today about 20 agencies have their internal dashboards up and running, 2 agencies have connected to the federal dashboard, and by next month, DHS expects that all 24 of its target agencies to be connected to the federal dashboard. As more agencies connect to the federal dashboard, DHS will have greater visibility across federal networks and will be better positioned to identify and mitigate malicious activity, including complex coordinated attacks. As representatives of vendors who work directly with DHS on CDM, the witnesses here today have a unique perspective on how to ensure federal agencies continue to prioritize cybersecurity investments, how the federal government can implement the lessons learned over the past 5 years to improve the program, and whether contracting personnel have the training necessary to deploy CDM quickly. I also hope the witnesses can speak to how the department's failure to name a permanent undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate, along with ongoing chief information officer vacancies across the federal government, are affecting the implementation of CDM. Our adversaries have made their interest in breaching federal networks crystal clear. Just last week, Trend Micro reported that Fancy Bear, the same Russian-backed hacking group that breached the Democratic National Committee in 2016, has been targeting the Senate's network. Although congressional networks do not participate in CDM, this troubling report serves as a reminder that the interest in breaching U.S. government networks persists and that the federal government must act more quickly to protect itself. On a final note, this subcommittee is also responsible for ensuring that federal policies support private sector efforts to secure critical infrastructure. Last summer, reports emerged that hackers successfully penetrated domestic energy companies and nuclear power plants. In light of the growing cyber threats against critical infrastructure, I would be interested in learning whether the private sector can benefit from implementing elements of CDM, like the dashboard, and whether efforts to implement CDM-like programs are already underway. I look forward to the insight of our panelists today, and I thank you all for being here. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. I want to thank both of you for your ongoing work to assess and improve the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to secure federal networks. Over the past decade, hackers have breached networks across the federal government, including the State Department, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Justice, Department of Energy, and the Office of Personnel Management. These hackers show no sign of slowing down. Instead, their tactics are growing more aggressive and more sophisticated. Congress has charged the Department of Homeland Security with important responsibilities associated with taking on evolving threats to federal networks. Chief among these responsibilities is helping federal agencies improve visibility of networked assets and prioritize efforts to correct vulnerabilities. Initiated in August 2013 and formally authorized in 2014, the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program commonly called CDM, is supposed to do just that. Through 4 phases of implementation, CDM will help agencies understand, number 1, what assets are on their network, number 2, who is on their network, 3, what is happening on their networks, and 4, how to protect data on their networks. Unfortunately, despite the security benefits CDM can provide, implementation has been slow. As of last month, nearly 5 years after CDM was launched, only 8 federal agencies had transitioned to operation and management of Phase 1. A number of reasons have been offered to explain why CDM implementation lagged behind expectations, including ambitious programmatic goals, challenges in reconciling diverse agency structure and architecture, and resource and leadership challenges, among others. The ranking member of the subcommittee just talked about the fact that top people are not in place to provide some of the absolute necessity for direction. There are a number of other things, Mr. Chair, that I could talk about, but I look forward to the testimony and ultimately an opportunity to ask some questions, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. Mr. Frank Demina is the Area Vice President for Federal at Splunk. Mr. Demina's entire 20-year career has been within the cybersecurity industry, including several years as a Security Operations Center Director and Consultant, providing advisory services and incident response support to public sector and commercial organizations. Thanks for being here. Mr. Dan Karianis, did I say that right? Is the Public Sector Director for RSA Archer. I noticed in your bio nearly 30 years of IT management and security experience, and I look forward to having the benefit of your insights on that today. I know the full committee does as well. Mr. Greg Mossberg is the Senior Vice President for Specific Operations at CGI Federal. Mr. Mossberg served as a commissioner on the Tech America Foundation 2011 Commission on the Leadership Opportunity in U.S. Deployment of the Cloud, or Cloud 2. Migrating to more shared services is certainly an important aspect of the CDM program, and so we're grateful to have you as a witness here today. And finally, Mr. A.R. Trey Hodgkins is the Senior Vice President for the Public Sector at the Information Technology Alliance for Public Sector. I saw, Mr. Hodgkins, that you received some awards for your work in IT procurement reform. That experience is one that I think will be very relevant to today's conversation. I'd now like to ask each of you witnesses to stand and raise your right hand so I can swear you in to testify. Do each of you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has been sworn and answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Demina for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program at the Department of Homeland Security. My name is Frank Demina, and I'm Area Vice President of Federal for Splunk. In this role, I've worked with federal agencies, including DHS, on multiple cybersecurity and data analytics projects. My entire 20-year career has been within the cybersecurity industry, including several years as a Security Operations Center Director. Splunk is a fast-growing software company in San Francisco with a singular mission: make machine data accessible, usable, and valuable to everyone. More than 13,000 companies, government agencies, and other organizations are using Splunk software. In the cybersecurity arena, Splunk's software platform often serves as the nerve center of an organization's Security Operations Center. In my testimony today, I'll provide my views on 3 main topics: the progress to date of the CDM program, opportunities to modernize and enhance the CDM program, and supporting CDM's continued success. The CDM program has made significant progress over the last several years in providing federal agencies with capabilities that identify cybersecurity risks on an ongoing basis, prioritize those risks based on potential impacts, and enable cybersecurity personnel to mitigate the most significant threats first. That progress is due to the dedication and hard work of the CDM team at DHS and the support that this program has received from Congress and DHS leadership. Phase 1 of CDM, which is focused on determining what is on the network, has helped federal agencies to identify endpoints on their networks and raise awareness of the extent of their cyber footprint. After deploying Phase 1 tools, some federal agencies found a significant number of additional endpoints within their enterprise. As a result, those agencies are now carrying out efforts to bring those endpoints into the program. Phase 2, which focuses on determining who is on the network, is just now rolling into production. DHS and the General Services Administration, or GSA, are in the process of procuring CDM Phase 3 and 4, which focuses on determining what is happening on the network. Once fully implemented, Phases 3 and 4 will give federal agencies the ability to move from legacy, time-based system accreditation to dynamic, risk-based, and event-driven authorization. This will vastly improve the overall security posture of the federal civilian government. Building on the progress to date, I believe there are important opportunities to further modernize and enhance the CDM program. One key opportunity is to better leverage the existing data collected throughout CDM. In our view, DHS should transform the existing CDM integration layer into a common data analytics fabric that is standardized across the program. The data analytics fabric would serve as a platform for collecting security-relevant data across federal agencies at scale, while enabling DHS to perform flexible search queries, build robust visualizations, and provide real-time reporting of the results. There are several key benefits to this approach. First, a common data analytics fabric would improve the granularity of data available to federal cyber analysts. Today, CDM data presented in the federal dashboard is summary data. Like a photograph, summary data provides a snapshot in time, but lacks the fidelity of a live video feed. Providing DHS analysts with greater detail and drill-down capability would significantly enhance their ability to protect the homeland. Second, this would provide DHS and security teams across federal agencies with access to data at machine speed. Across government, there is a clear need for real-time access to cyber data, from the analyst up to the executive. Third, a common data analytics fabric would provide the foundation to correlate CDM data with security data from other shared service initiatives like Einstein. Allowing the analysts at DHS to connect information from Einstein and CDM would be a mission enabler and provide a level of visibility that is not possible today. This approach might also result in additional economic benefits for the government by standardizing CDM components, reducing human capital expenditures, and enabling operational efficiencies across CDM. Promoting CDM's continued success over the next several years will require continued funding through appropriations, robust oversight by Congress, and sustained leadership from DHS. Success also requires a smart acquisition strategy that is flexible and encourages participation by innovative cybersecurity companies. Thoughtful design of the next phase of CDM could help DHS future-proof the program. CDM must allow for additions of new technologies that enable risk-based monitoring and protection for emerging information technologies, such as the Internet of Things, cloud, and microservices. In closing, I will reiterate that the CDM program has made important strides. Now is the time to look at modernizing the approach and enhancing the capabilities of this program. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today. Look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Demina. Chair now recognizes Mr. Karianis for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, Ranking Member Thompson. Committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of Homeland Security's Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program. I commend the committee's initiative to better understand this mission-critical program. My name is Dan Karianis, and I've spent over 30 years in the information technology industry. Currently, I am the RSA Archer Public Sector Global Director for RSA Security, part of Dell Technologies. I also lead the RSA Archer CDM Dashboard Program and Archer's initiatives in the federal, state, local, and the international public sector. RSA has been in the cybersecurity industry and a leader in that industry for over 30 years, serving more than 14,000 global customers in many sectors of the economy. RSA solutions help detect, investigate, and respond to advanced attacks. We confirm and manage identities. We ultimately reduce intellectual property theft, fraud, and cybercrime. What is Archer as it relates to CDM today? RSA Archer is the commercial off-the-shelf software solution chosen for the CDM dashboard. The platform is approximately 1,400 global deployments, including many Fortune 100 companies as well as government entities. Archer is a flexible, browser-based, scalable, easily deployed, and fully integrated within a comprehensive dashboard architecture, meeting DHS's current and future dashboard requirements. RSA is committed to the continued success of CDM. We meet regularly with key stakeholders within the DHS itself, prime contractors, to ensure our technology is well aligned with current and anticipated needs of the program. We have provided flexible licensing arrangements and have undertaken several releases of our products and enhancements that map directly to DHS requirements. We are supporting the CDM program through the dashboard contractor and again also through the various prime contractors. As a result of our experience and involvement with DHS and the CDM program, we'd like to propose the following recommendations. First, we strongly encourage DHS to maintain ongoing control of the dashboard. We see the CDM dashboard as both a strategic executive risk management visualization tool as well as an agency operational tool. Standardization and consistency across the government is critical to program success. Having a standardized risk management approach with one organization, DHS, responsible for managing cybersecurity risk across the civilian government is key and a reason we believe that the program is succeeding and will succeed. Centralized management and standardized risk scoring provides confidence in consistent measurement and representation of risk across all government departments and agencies. Second, we encourage DHS to continue facilitating a shared vision approach for program success. Continued dialogue among DHS, RSA, and dashboard and group prime contractors allows us to reflect on our base software and the architecture and its design and plan for future software enhancements to benefit the program going forward. Third, we encourage an active ongoing training program as part of the CDM initiative. The contractors who have invested in RSA Archer training have accelerated their learning curve on Archer and increased their deployment successes. We also recommend DHS personnel participate in Archer training so they can better understand how they can get more benefit out of the RSA Archer platform as it relates to CDM. Fourth, we urge the subcommittee to continue its current and strong support of the CDM program and ensure DHS has the necessary authorization and funding to build upon the current implementation. Finally, we encourage CDM information to be analyzed for government benefits beyond the initial CDM scope. One of the byproduct benefits of CDM and the program that it's serving is the agencies can leverage data aggregated across the government that are currently out-of-scope requirements. For example, agencies can enhance their assessment and authorization or continuity of operations capabilities and processes by leveraging existing CDM data. Both the data elements can be leveraged by agencies to enhance their security posture, their capabilities, and their reactions to threats. In closing, we believe the CDM program is having a very positive impact on how government, as well as commercial organizations, think about managing cyber risk. RSA believes the CDM program is well positioned to help the federal government better understand and react to these cyber threats. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Karianis. The chair recognizes Mr. Mossberg for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Greg Mossberg. I am the Senior Vice President for Strategic Operations at CGI Federal. On behalf of CGI Federal's 6,000-plus dedicated employees providing services to over 100 federal departments and agencies, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the progress being made to better secure the federal government systems through continuous diagnostics and mitigation. CGI Federal plays an important role in the CDM initiative in providing credential management to users at all 23 CFO Act agencies and 3 others to enable greater visibility. Providing security to any single network is a challenge. Recognizing the enormity of scaling across the entire federal government, DHS is using an incremental approach to identify and deploy capabilities to participating agencies. The first phase of the CDM program began in January 2013. CDM Phase 1 examined what was on the network. Through discovery tools, a federal agency can identify all of its hardware and software. Using policies and rules, a determination can be made about whether an asset should be on the network. Next, CDM tools can be used to install patches, continuously scan for vulnerabilities and ensure software is configured properly and securely. Studies have shown that cyber hygiene, including asset management, scanning, patching, and proper configuration controls, can stop up to 85% of cyber attacks. At the completion of Phase 1, every device in the federal government will have a master device record, allowing increased visibility and management. In June 2016, DHS began rolling out CDM Phase 2, focusing on who is on the network. This phase applies the same concept of cyber hygiene to users, collecting and aggregating information about users from multiple systems into a central location from which agencies are able to monitor different aspects about their network users. This data is important because research continues to show that many security breaches are linked to improper use of credentials, including access through accounts that should have been terminated. Further, this information will permit federal agencies to verify that only authorized users with the proper credentials are accessing their networks. Soon, DHS will be rolling out Phases 3 and 4, which focuses on what is happening on the network and how the data itself is protected. Data from all CDM phases is channeled to agency-level dashboards for display in action. Information from these agency dashboards is aggregated into a federal-level dashboard to provide a government-wide view of how agencies are performing and identify the greatest areas of risk. I'm especially pleased that the subcommittee has both tools and systems integration represented at the table today. CDM often is discussed in the context of tool acquisition, yet the integration and consulting services provided are key to federal agency success. Given the shortage of cybersecurity professionals, the vast number of security products available, and competing IT priorities. CDM provides not only cyber expertise, but also training, testing, and governance support. In structuring the CDM acquisitions, DHS has had the difficult task of balancing the customized solutions for each agency with leveraging economies of scale and solution repeatability. DHS also needed to balance the benefits of using a single integrator with deep solution expertise versus multiple integrators with agency-specific knowledge. As a result, DHS and their contracting partner at GSA, a group known as FedSim, carefully evaluated and addressed these trade-offs in the new series of CDM acquisitions called Defend. The new Defend strategy provides a variety of benefits that I would be glad to discuss during the Q&A period. As noted earlier, CGI Federal currently is delivering the credential management solution to 26 agencies under a 2-year task order. To date, this complicated IT implementation effort has enjoyed remarkable collaboration among CGI Federal, the agencies, and DHS, supported by GSA FedSim. In fact, early deployments already have provided agencies with insight into potential issues that can now be addressed. While everyone feels the urgency brought on by continuous cyber attacks, it is important to not lose sight of the fact that providing security to networks as large and complex as those of the U.S. government is an enormous undertaking that requires a solid foundation on which to build advanced capabilities. CDM is one of the first efforts of its type, and we should recognize the impact that it is having. Let me close first by thanking the folks at DHS and GSA's FedSim office for their partnership and urgency in supporting the CDM implementation. All are focused on schedules, budgets, and a relentless drive to get the best from industry. I also want to thank the subcommittee for making CDM a priority. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to answering any questions that you or the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mossberg. Chair now recognizes Mr. Hodgkins for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Richmond, and members of the committee. On behalf of the members of the IT Alliance for Public Sector, or ITAPS, thank you for the opportunity to share our perspectives today on the Department of Homeland Security Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program. ITAPS represents almost 90 of the most innovative companies offering IT goods and services in the federal public sector. We applaud the committee's efforts to understand and explore the CDM program, the state of CDM tool acquisition, and what barriers in policy or practice exist to rolling out CDM across the federal government. Last year, ITAPS provided the administration with numerous recommendations to modernize federal cybersecurity practices, including how to protect federal networks through accelerated adoption of Einstein and the CDM program. These recommendations include requiring regular automated vulnerability scanning of federal networks, updating procurement guidance to reflect the speed of cyber threats, expanding existing programs to recruit and retain a strong cybersecurity workforce, and leveraging new technology and integrating security tools into IT deployments. DHS is implementing recommendations included in the President's IT Modernization Report. These range from securing government systems in commercial clouds, something not included in the original CDM plan, to completing the acquisition strategy for new long-term task orders that offer CDM lifecycle support to agencies. ITAP suggests that Congress focus on the following. Number one, accelerate procurement cycles to keep pace with cyber threats. The committee should work to ensure that there are sufficient numbers of adequately trained contracting personnel to deploy CDM tools in a timely fashion to keep up with the evolving threat landscape. Number two, accelerate adoption of CDM through oversight. The committee should exercise oversight to ensure that agencies are prioritizing funding for CDM solutions because agencies are reluctant to contribute to funding their own security. Many don't put a line item in their budget requests and seek to solely rely upon DHS funding for CDM deployment. Unpredictable federal appropriations substantially contribute to this condition, as agencies are not able to effectively plan, identify, acquire, and deploy cyber tools in truncated budget cycles. Number three, experienced personnel with appropriate skill sets and vendors with proven success at enterprise scale are critical to the success of CDM. The committee should work with DHS to ensure that the acquisition plan for Phase 3 contemplates the skills necessary for effective implementation, the budget to attract and retain individuals with such skills, and vendor qualifications based on experience success. Number four, protect federal data. It has been almost 3 years since the Oprium data breach, and DHS has yet to implement Phase 4 of CDM to provide data-level protection capabilities, such as digital rights management, microsegmentation, and data masking. Number five, enhance accountability for agency adoption of and deployment of CDM through robust use of the CDM dashboard. The federal dashboard compiles summary feeds from all the agencies regarding their adoption and deployment of CDM. This tool will eventually provide a broad view of the government's cyber posture to help DHS and OMB determine where resources are needed to strengthen agency systems. The CDM dashboard is also one specific means for Congress to hold agencies accountable for their progress. Number six, the CDM Program Office should educate state, local, and tribal governments about the CDM tools and capabilities available. States, localities, and tribal governments are facing similar cyber challenges and threats, and governments have made cybersecurity a top priority, but many need help with protecting their data and networks. The committee should work with DHS to create an outreach program to ensure that these other government jurisdictions are aware of CDM, the tools and capabilities that are available, and how they can acquire CDM capabilities for their own use through Schedule 70 at GSA. And number seven, ensure adequate means to attract and retain a cyber-skilled workforce. Congress should create innovative means to attract cyber-skilled applicants and retain them once hired. It should also look to rapidly draw down the security clearance backlog. Imagine what the government cyber workforce would look like and could do if just 10% of the over 700,000 employees and contractors awaiting investigations could get cleared. To close, Mr. Chairman, the technology sector supports the CDM program in its various phases as an important and effective means to secure the federal government networks and systems. More improvements can be made, though, and I hope that our recommendations can help the committee focus on making CDM better. We look forward to the opportunity to work with Congress and the Department on this important issue, and I'm happy to answer your questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hodgkins. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses for taking the time to be with us on this important topic. It sounds like everyone shares a relatively optimistic assessment of CDM so far. So to put it in plain terms, given that in Phase 1, we basically learned how many devices were on federal networks that federal agency CIOs didn't know about, the sort of shadow IT phenomenon, which presents a huge problem for all of us. For whoever wants to take the question, do you feel confident that we have a total picture of what is on federal networks at this point? And if not, how long will it take to have total visibility into what devices are connected and connecting to our networks? Don't all jump at once. We can just go. We can go from here that way. Yeah.
I'll take a stab.
I can go first, Greg.
Great.
Just share that we do not believe the government has total visibility into the assets it possesses on its networks and systems. It has done inventories for specific purposes. For example, risk mitigation, but it doesn't understand everything it owns. And one of the things that we've identified in the procurement process that can help change that is, number one, the government should create that inventory, but number two, it should begin to keep track of the things it's buying and deploying as it buys them. Currently, the systems that are used to acquire these tools, for example, in CDM and any other capability the government acquires, do not inventory those goods and services as they're acquired. So there's no running track, no running inventory, no automated means of keeping track of what we're buying and what perhaps we're retiring. So we think that would be an area that could be improved, yes.
Sir.
Go down the line in order? Yeah. So I'd echo, I don't think that we've got the complete picture yet of all the IT assets, but the point is, I think the goal is, as phase one is completed, that you would get to a point where you had a complete inventory. Sure. I think what Trey said is very important. It doesn't end, right? We're going to keep buying and keep adding to the inventory, and so the process has got to be kept in place, and it's got to be an ongoing vigilance to achieve that. The other element I'd add is the scope, as addressed in Defend, which is the next phase of CDM, has got to expand between on-prem or on-premises inventory out into the cloud and mobile devices to make sure that we really draw on the circle around the right goal, if you will.
Sure.
I think that was one of the challenges that at the beginning of the program people encountered was a lot of the agencies, there was more there than they thought.
Yeah.
And I think people had to kind of step back, understand that, document all that before they can progress and move forward. Certainly, if you have all that data of all those assets, all that information, and collecting all that, there's a lot of interesting things you could do about that and report on it and track it. Tracking not just a individual asset, but potentially even someday the component parts that make up that asset, which will also be important from a cybersecurity threat perspective.
Thank you.
I agree with everything said so far. I'll just add that continuous monitoring should be looked at as a journey and not a destination. There's been great success so far, and that visibility is not complete, but there is a solid foundation for a cybersecurity program here. That data can provide immense value, both from a risk scoring perspective and from the ability for agencies and DHS to respond to incidents and perform threat analytics. So I agree with the comments that there's more progress to come, but I think there is a success story here and the foundation has been built.
Sure. And then, obviously as that phase one journey continues and evolves, we want to make sure we're making progress on the other phases. Mr. Hodgkins, I think you mentioned something about phase four, and I just wonder, could you tell me, how would a delay in implementation of phase 3 and 4 impact our ability to protect the federal.gov domain? And besides adequate funding levels, what does the CDM program need to make sure that we're reaching our goals in those subsequent phases?
Well, I touched on a number of elements that Congress could perhaps focus on to improve. One is that agencies now they seem to be relying on the pool of money that Congress gives to DHS for this activity as a means of funding all of the CDM activities, even within the agencies. The inconsistent budget process has also contributed because agencies cannot begin to spend dollars until they're appropriated. And if their planning, their execution, their identification of contractors, identification of which tools they need happens, and we end up with a fiscal year where only 5 months are actually appropriated, it's too short of a time frame to effectively complete that, deploy the activity, and get the dollars obligated for a contractor. So it creates tremendous challenges, and those are some areas that delay the implementation of a lot of programs, including CDM. Delaying CDM in the way that you're talking about phase 3 and 4 don't get us to the end point that we've all discussed or raised in some form or fashion as fast as we need to get there. The threats are happening now, and we need to move forward. I mentioned accelerating acquisition cycles. There's a variety of ways that we can do that to try and improve that.
Well, I've run out of time, but thank you for raising the budgetary picture. I know we're grappling with that this week, and we tend to talk about it only in the context of hard defense, but it impacts everything the federal government does. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Richmond, for his questions.
Thank you. I'll start with all the witnesses. There's a workforce component to CDM in that agencies need to organize their cybersecurity and other personnel to implement the use of CDM. How is the shortage of skilled cyber professionals throughout the federal government impacting CDM performance? In any order.
It's actually having a tremendous impact, Mr. Richmond. I noted, for example, that it's a challenge for both the federal government and contracting employees to be deployed when they can't get their clearances through that process in efficient and timely fashion. There are over 700,000 sitting there, and truly, imagine what we could do if we could get just 10% of that through and deploy those people for the cyber workforce. We also have challenges in that people come into the federal government, they learn skills, and then they move into the private sector. People from the private sector is also a challenge getting them to come back in. There are a number of exercises underway now to try and identify incentives for companies to lend, if you will, their best and brightest to come and work on some of these problems in the federal government. The Center of Excellence exercise is going on now through the White House to deploy the IT modernization plan, and it's an example of trying to implement that, where they're seeking to bring in subject matter expertise from outside to help address and define requirements to solve problems like cybersecurity, and then they can execute internally with their own employees, and they can also bring in additional contract personnel.
Thank you, and thanks for the question, Congressman. As I noted in my opening remarks, I was very appreciative that this committee had both tool vendors and systems integration at the table. I think that's an important part to consider in addressing the skills gap that you raised. There's no question that there's a skills challenge in the federal government and also in the private sector, and it really is going to take continued collaboration between the both to make sure we've got the necessary skills to implement successfully the CDM program.
Well, but you also mentioned in your testimony about the learning curve. And I guess my next question would be, is there a need for more training on how to use CDM capabilities like the dashboard? And then two, do agencies now need help developing or updating their internal governance to make sure it's compatible with CDM?
Yes, I think the answer to both questions is yes, and the scope of both training and governance is included in the CDM program so that as these technologies are implemented and processes are put in place, that training and governance is part of the individual task orders and agency implementations.
Okay.
Congressman Richmond, as it relates to the dashboard specifically, absolutely, there is a need for training to ensure that once it's fully operationalized at the agency level and even at the federal level, that personnel are trained to get the maximum value out of what it's presenting. The risk scores, calculations that are occurring, understanding what threats might be out there, having to have trained personnel to be able to understand and act on that is critically important. So an ongoing training element just around the dashboard itself, I would highly recommend, and that was in my opening remarks.
So I would add to that well, private sector is dealing with the same problem. The cyber skills shortage is real, and across the board, it's impacting government, it's impacting private sector. I do think there are opportunities to look at how can we, and that problem won't be solved in the short term. That's going to take a while to solve across the board between industry and government and that continued partnership. I do think there are some things the industry can do from a technology perspective to help offset some of those challenges. And there is work ongoing in part of the cybersecurity industry in a space called orchestration automation. Those tools are maturing. And while that won't solve the problem completely, those can help add efficiencies to the program. Additionally, what the core of our testimony from Splunk and my testimony today is about is leveraging what has already been invested in, leveraging the data that's already present in a CDM system to gain greater efficiencies and to enhance the mission at DHS. Speaking from personal experience in my time working in cyber operations, the data being collected today is being used for risk profiling and for risk prioritization and for visibility. And that's great. That is a core requirement of the security program. But there's an opportunity to also use that data from an operational perspective and to assist in the mission for threat hunting and understanding the tactics and techniques of APTs out there. So I do believe that is a problem, and I do believe technology can help. It won't completely solve it, but there are ways to improve the productivity of the investments made today.
Thank you. Now you're back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, now I recognize myself for questions. So following up on your comment earlier, Mr. Domina, about CDM being a journey, not a destination, and some of the testimony that we've already heard, I mean, I think, at phase one, not having full visibility, that's understandable. Obviously, we all want it to be rolled out to all 4 phases more quickly, and I know there's challenges with respect to that, but I guess as we approach sort of the halftime or intermission of this program, if you will, I guess I want to hear on the record from all of you that once we get to phase 4 as fully implemented, do we still foresee CDM as a program that will be effective and agile and nimble enough to deal with the cyber threats that we're facing at that point in time? And I'll just go across the board.
So there's a lot to that question. I think, and thank you for the question, Sarah. I think regarding specifically phase 4, the requirements are not still defined there. So I think there's some work that still needs to be done to figure out what's going to be accomplished, how it's going to be accomplished to offer data protection. I think the challenge and an issue that needs to be addressed there is there are major disruptions occurring in the private sector to the way IT is delivered and handled. Traditional IT is being replaced by serverless models, the rise of microservices and containers and software-defined networking. And so as DHS and team and CDM leadership figure out their approach for phase 4, I think it's an issue and question that will need to be addressed, because where does data reside in a serverless architecture? And that's a challenge ahead. Beyond that, I think looking at continuous monitoring as a program, and to answer your question about where does it go, today we have a foundation. You can't secure what you can't see, but the vision would be something that is near real time, and to Congressman Richmond's point in his opening remarks, providing situational awareness. You could envision a state where we have the equivalent of a cyber weather map, where as meteorologists today look at atmospheric data to predict weather threats and weather patterns across the country, once we reach that state and we have successful real-time monitoring and be able to access data at a granular level, we could predict from activity occurring in one part of the government or see warning signs that would happen at other parts. In a perfect world, and if we take that one step further, we could have the equivalent of a tornado warning, where attacks against one part of the government are being seen and reacted to in real time, and then the cyber defenders in our government can take proactive actions to defend in advance of those attacks.
Congressman, I guess a couple thoughts around that. First, I think once we get to phase 4 and potentially beyond, an opportunity that I think CDM provides is the tuning of it and extracting more value out of it over the course of time, kind of moving from more of a cyber hygiene program to more of a highly tuned response program where I could quickly interact with anything and everything that I have from an information source perspective, and be able to leverage that information to react rather than days and weeks to hours to minutes. I think one of the challenges that CDM has identified, and you've heard some of the comments about that today, and one of the opportunities that CDM presents is to really orchestrate a highly defined environment that could accelerate people's time to action, and in time to action dealing with a threat that's out there. The threat will continue. It will continue to progress and become more nimble, and so we need to be able to do the same thing, and I think CDM is a great start to do that. It's tuning that environment and making it more productive over the course of time for all.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'll just put a small fine point on this. I think that it truly is a journey, not a destination. I don't think this is something that we need to think about as getting to done. I think this is something that we need to continually improve and remain vigilant on. I think we ought to strive for a vision that is not even real time or predictive, but really gets, not even real time, but predictive in nature, and begins to look at behavioral analytics and some of the activities that can be correlated across the domain or the enterprise to begin to predict where we may run into problems, both internal to an agency and external to an agency. I think that's the vision that we ought to strive for.
I would just add, to echo the other comments, that CDM will survive if it can evolve. It's got to keep pace with the threats. It's also got to keep pace with the evolution of technology, the innovation of technologies. As was noted, new forms of computing capability as they come down the pike. And then it's also got to, this is not an operation occurring in isolation. The federal government is undertaking significant strides to modernize specific networks and systems, and those will begin to incorporate new cybersecurity capabilities that can then be connected with CDM or can share information with CDM in new ways that we can't do today.
My time has expired, but I have a question I want to ask, and if you can answer it quickly, and if not, incorporate some answers into some of the other members' questions. But to this theme of CDM being a journey, my question, I guess, is for all of the folks up here. What is the low-hanging fruit for us as legislators? Where can we work to make effective changes to make this CDM journey faster and better and more effective, whether that's programmatic authorities or, the parameters or acquisitions or appropriations with respect to CDM. I know, Mr. Karianis, you intimated almost a phase 5 and looking at something to that effect. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, maybe thinking beyond CDM itself, what it is today in the 4 phases, one of the concepts we have kicked around and thought about is how do you extend what the government is doing around CDM to the community around the government that's supporting the government on an ongoing basis? If you think about the government doing more outsourcing on an ongoing basis, you are now more dependent on those resources. And so consequently, I think one thought that the CDM and the committee here should think about is how do we extend some of those principles and guidelines, guidance that you're giving and directives you're giving agencies today around CDM to some of the community that's closest to the government and helping the government perform its mission.
Want to weigh in?
I agree, and I'll add to that. I think there is, going back to my testimony today, there is untapped value in CDM today. The intent of the data being collected today is for risk scoring and for asset visibility, and that's great and that's important. That same data could be incredibly valuable for analysts working at DHS, the teams working with Einstein in their mission. And one area where I would suggest, additional policy review or oversight is working with DHS to ensure the appropriate rules are in place to access that data for that purpose.
So a quick comment on the pace and the speed with which we can continue the journey with CDM. My colleague, Mr. Hodgkins, has mentioned the security clearance issue writ large a couple of times. I think in particular to CDM, when it comes to the contractor community working with DHS to implement for agencies, looking at the reciprocity of security clearances between DHS and the individual agencies would go a long way to speeding the time of delivery on the projects.
Mr. Chairman, I also noted several things in my opening statements. The committee can exercise oversight of the appropriations that the agencies take and ensure that they're putting in that line item to fund their CDM activities, where today we do not see that consistently. The committee can look to ensure that appropriate acquisition workforce skills are both created and then deployed, and that there's sufficient numbers. And then the committee can work both on this program and more broadly across Congress to think about how the government can acquire commercial capabilities in a more rapid fashion. We've created a substantial number of government-unique requirements that have slowed that process down, and those reviews are underway as we speak through various means. But that's a way that we can also look to improve the process the committee can participate in looking to accelerate. The cyber workforce also, we've identified that there's a shortage of those skills, and that's a long-term solution. And then finally, just oversight of the program, making sure that the different phases are advancing in the way that they're intended and they're advancing in the timeframes that are intended.
Thank you all, and I appreciate the panel's indulgence. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and also to our ranking member and to our witnesses today. Thank you so much for being here. As we learned from the OPM hack in 2015, agencies need a strong, secure system for managing who is authorized to access sensitive data. To address this, CDM Phase 2 calls for the creation of a centralized master user record, among other things, to help agencies manage credentials and privileged access. And this question is for any or all of you. How effective do you think the master user record will be? And are there areas where in Phase 2, where it is currently, and how it is currently designed, where it falls short?
I'll take the first step. I do think that the Phase 2, the credential management and the privilege management aspects of Phase 2 are very, effective, have the potential to be very effective, not only in the creation of the master user record, but in the policy enforcement of having both the credentials that you and I are used to and a user ID and login, something that we know to access the system, but also a physical asset that we have in a PIV card or a little ID card. The combination of both will go a long way to preventing the situations like we had with OPM or things that you're familiar with in the private sector, like the Target breach last year.
Others?
I agree with Mr. Mossbar. The only footnote I'll add to that is it's my understanding that the identity data is key, and having information on user behavior is important. I think the challenge there is bringing it all together. My understanding is the identity data is not currently feeding into the dashboard or being correlated with the existing CDM data. And the real power of this program is the ability to do analytics on this data. And if that data is not brought together and the analytics does not happen, it's a missed opportunity.
If I could add, data is key to everything here. So as a master user record, the concept of being able to obtain data from not only one agency, but all agencies, and being able to access that, bring all that together and associate that to an individual's, it's key. So the concept of, if I have very little data, then we're going to have a challenge being able to relate all that to a record. So that's critical in terms of the aggregation of that information and be able to leverage it.
Anyone else want to speak on it, Mr.? Okay, thank you. Also, for any or all of you, from your perspective, what examples do you believe already exists that you feel best demonstrates the value of CDM?
I'll take that one first. So thank you, Congresswoman. There was a recent example during the last WannaCry event that occurred, where some of the agencies who have been making good progress leveraging and accessing, bringing data together as a part of CDM, was able to leverage that data, quickly do a report on all the information that they had of what systems would potentially be impacted by it, and be able to quickly put an action plan in place to address that, and therefore, not have to deal with a very painful experience. So it was, the good news is, in a very immediate way, while everything is not deployed immediately across the board, we've not gone through all the phases, we're already seeing some agencies get benefit from this by DHS directive, and I think there'll be a lot more of that to come as the program continues to build and roll out.
That's great.
I'll add to that, as I mentioned in my testimony, during Phase 1 deployments, there were several agencies that discovered they had additional endpoints than they were aware of. So in one perspective, that can be looked at as a challenge. I see it as a positive. I see it as a success story. The first part of an effective cyber strategy is understanding your footprint and understanding your security posture. And that information and that intelligence is a success story and step forward for those agencies in being able to appropriately defend their assets.
That's great. Others? Mr.
I
Mossberg?
I agree wholeheartedly with those two. I'll take it from a slightly different angle. I think one of the biggest successes that the CDM program has demonstrated is an incorporation of lessons learned. After going through Phase 1 and Phase 2, DHS and their partners at GSA and FedSim changed the approach of the program to in what's now called Defend, to accommodate a couple of things. One very important was an expanded access to the latest and greatest from industry, in particular with software products, by changing the way those software products could be procured by the agency through the integrator. So it enables greater access to that. The second was an expansion of the period of performance with the individual projects that will be executed in Phase 3 and Phase 4. And what's important about that is, as you have a longer relationship between integrator and agency to deploy the solution, you have greater reuse of the staff from a security clearance standpoint than you had previously. So it gets past some of those obstacles from a pace standpoint around the security clearance.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Hodgkins?
I would just add that the program, one of the things that we would see success is that it's something that can be applied in a relatively uniform fashion across the government. It's not common to find consistent uniformity for government requirements in contracting or in plans and protection programs of this nature. So it's a success that this is being rolled out in a consistent, uniform fashion. And we have a repeatable activity and repeatable successes and measurable, repeatable conclusions that we can draw across agencies.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's my first time in the committee, so it's good to be part of the subcommittee. It's an honor.
Glad to have you.
I'm a retired 30-year Air Force guy, signals intelligence, and worked a little bit in cyber. And one thing I took away from that is we have some of the best cyber capabilities in the world, particularly in the intelligence and the offensive side. But we also have the most vulnerabilities, and which you are working that part of it. So thank you for what you're doing. I heard one of our senior generals say once that we have the biggest rocks. We also live in the largest glass house when it comes to cyber, so two-edged sword there, right? Mr. Mossberg, I know you talk a little bit about hygiene or the right cyber hygiene. Could you just talk a little more succinctly, what does that really mean and where are we at in getting to that proper hygiene?
Sure, I think, and I first referenced it with regard to phase one and the focus on what is on individual networks. And after creating a master device record and an inventory of the assets that exist on the network, a rigorous, constant patching of that software and maintaining the proper configuration is that hygiene. And so we're well into phase one, but as I think in earlier responses, not complete. We don't have that complete inventory yet. But you heard some of the responses here a second ago with even some of the more recent issues and attacks that we have encountered, from WannaCry to some of the recent hardware attacks. Our agencies were better prepared because of the upgrade, the patching that was occurring, the hygiene that was occurring on the devices that had been identified, but also the data that had been collected for even when those devices weren't yet being patched or having the proper hygiene applied to them. We at least knew about them, and then the agencies could prioritize their reaction to addressing them and prevent those attacks from causing harm.
And you're having to do that with all 24 federal agencies.
Yes, that all 24 will roll through the phase one.
And do you have is the software that you're using, is it the same for all 24? Because I think that would be pretty challenging.
Well, and I think the goal of the CDM program is to have a common approach in these.
Right.
Quite honestly, CGI is engaged in phase two in the credential management. I defer to the vendors that are rolling out phase one on the specifics there.
I can make a comment about that, Congressman Bacon. At the end of the day, one of the challenges for a lot of the primes, taking the dashboard, deploying it within respective agencies, but to your question, lots of different technologies that are being used by a lot of different agencies. So I think that was one of the complicated elements of what CDM was trying to tackle, was leveraging what was already out there, augmenting what was there, and putting into best practice and use all of those to deal with a master device record, being able to populate it, have accurate information there. And so that's been a big challenge, I think, for a lot of the prime contractors.
And some of these countries are so advanced in this area, it just takes one device that we have not had the patch for to find a vulnerability in. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, sir, I would.
Mr. Karianis, what is the federal enterprise where is the federal enterprise in developing their CDM dashboards from your perspective? Are the barriers to fully implementing and using the dashboard technical, or is it administrative?
I would basically say that I think it is a combination of the two. So we have worked very hard to stay as close as we can with DHS, with the dashboard prime, as well as the prime contractors working within the agencies. We're learning a lot of what people need the dashboard to be able to do at the agency level as well as at the federal level. We've been augmenting our software on an ongoing basis. We have a release schedule at least twice a year. And the idea around that is to continue to add additional components, upgrades, enhancements to our software to enable them to progress and to do more work, the work that they need to do to drive CDM to success.
I appreciate your challenge. Coming from the Air Force, we try to do a dashboard. That was hard enough for the Air Force because you have different major commands underneath it: airlift, fighter, space. But this dashboard you're building is going to be a one-size-fits-all for all 24 agencies.
So the current architected approach, and I think it's the right one, I made that comment in my opening remarks, one of the key elements of this is having consistency from a dashboard tool across the entire agency level dashboards and at the federal level. Having consistency, having DHS maintain that consistent approach ensures that you're seeing similar information types, risk scores, et cetera, rolling up to the agency and to the federal level. If you didn't do that, you have everybody doing something slightly different, to your very point about within the DoD environment. You know, you start seeing a lot of apples and oranges and lots of different variations. So consistency is paramount in our judgment from a dashboard perspective to its CDM program success.
I just think with all the different missions, that's a challenge because everybody has a different mission area and different unique requirements. But yet I understand you got to standardize if you want to be able to defend the system better. So I had some more questions, but my time is out. And thank you for your expertise and thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your participation and testimony here today. Mr. Hodgkins, if I could start with you. Obviously, it's a very important topic, and appreciate all the contributions you have made to this discussion. But, Mr. Hodgkins, the administration has recently released the report to the President on federal IT modernization that pushes strongly toward greater adoption of cloud-based applications and services. The CDM has traditionally been focused on identifying and protecting federal assets within our federal networks. And as federal assets are deployed in cloud architectures, how well is CDM positioned for this new paradigm, and how does the program need to change to ensure it continues to be effective?
Well, as I noted in my testimony, Mr. Langevin, cloud deployment of federal assets was not really a major focus of CDM when it was first formulated and put together. So that is an element that, as we and as I noted about the comment on or question on evolution, as those new technologies come into play, as those new efficiencies are identified and the government adopts those, CDM will need to evolve to address the new risks that might occur because we're moving in different directions with new capabilities.
Okay. And as a follow-up, are certain CDM phases more or less effective in protecting cloud assets? And I certainly would welcome comment from some of the other witnesses on the next question. Does DHS's ability to maintain situation awareness change with respect to cloud solutions?
On your first question, sir, the effort to identify the users should be something that can be transferred over when those activities move to the cloud, so that you should still have the same type of identification and authentication capabilities, and those should be reusable, if you will. I'm not aware that the others are positioned or directly thinking. The vendors at the table may be able to more directly answer that question for you.
I was going to make a comment about that, Congressman. So at the end of the day, I made some comments earlier about this universe of contractors or support elements are in and around the government. So if you think about the cloud environment itself, you have organizations that are providing federally certified cloud environments, which is a good thing. But I do think that some of the underlying principles and elements of what CDM is should be driven out more broadly to some of those suppliers, so they are inheriting some of the inherent capabilities of and underlying tenets of what CDM is trying to do for the government itself.
So I'll add to that. I think there's been some progress with regards to how do we secure the cloud, how do we monitor cloud, and this is where FedRAMP comes into play. And I think DHS is looking at that. Cloud's been with us for some time, and it's not going anywhere. So I think that's a problem that's going to be solved. I think the bigger challenge is what's going to happen as we move into the Internet of Things. Every device is connected. How do we secure and monitor mobile devices as we move and solve the human capital gaps we have in our workforce and have more people work remotely? How do we deal with the changes and disruptions that are occurring from things such as containerization and when traditional data centers don't exist anymore and when we're in a serverless environment? So I think those are the bigger challenges ahead. Cloud is certainly important and will be the mechanism for delivery of a lot of these technologies, but those are the ones that I think if you look longer term, 1 to 3 years out, that will need some proper planning. I think the most important piece here, if you look at the future CDM, is that careful and thoughtful planning has to go into the design decisions made today. Because the worst possible outcome would be if a decision made now would prevent the use of some future yet to be released cybersecurity technology or information technology asset. And I think some of the delays in phase one were a result of that heavy lift of a lot of those design decisions that had to happen. And we're seeing phases hopefully accelerate now as some of that design work is complete.
Well, this is a good follow-up, a good segue into my next question. Well, CDM now provides a method to streamline acquisition of cybersecurity tools across agencies. It's still incumbent upon each agency to define and execute a risk management strategy and process. How are individual agencies utilizing the tools provided by CDM to create an overall risk management strategy and prioritize their acquisition of cybersecurity tools? And have you observed any changes or improvements since CDM has been implemented? Mr. Hodgkins, if we can maybe start with you.
Well, I think the answer to your last question is yes, that there have been improvements since CDM has been deployed. I think that agencies are required to make a different set of assessments and determine their risks more effectively, and CDM is deploying tool sets that helps them try to address and protect against those risks and threats. I believe that there's obviously room to grow, and I think that agencies can always do a better job of assessing their risks, but we are seeing improvement, and CDM is one of the factors that's contributing to that improvement, their ability to identify those risks and trying to position themselves to protect or defend against it.
I'd just briefly say I agree that we have seen the results since the beginning of the CDM program, but I think it's with the defend portion that's recently and currently underway, where we've got the streamlined acquisition process for the tools, where we have the potential to see the greatest benefit for individual agencies to get quicker access to the tools that are specific to their agencies. And also, as technology evolves with the threats, take advantage of in a quicker fashion some of the latest technology.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have some additional questions I'll submit for the record, and if I could have our witnesses respond to them, it'd be helpful. Thank you all very much. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Ranking Member Richmond. This is an important hearing. In fact, the constant oversight of our cybersecurity system is really crucial for the defense of this nation, and as well the important responsibilities that are driven by the cyber system. I heard the words careful and thoughtful planning, and I think that is clearly the framework in which we should be going forward. I have a series of questions, but the thoughtful and careful planning causes me to want to pose a question to you. Even as I know that the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program deals with the attempt to ensure that the federal network is healthy. But it is a constant changing system, and there are many parts of it that are impacted by the human element. So just take, you are obviously in the private sector. You know that we are querying about the incident that occurred in Hawaii. Certainly it was a cyber system of sort. Would you speculate on what might have been needed, how that translates into what good the system that we're dealing with is trying to do? We're obviously, all of us are paying attention in terms of the massive investigation that is going forward, not only state, but I certainly believe a full federal investigation should occur, because we have a very important role in the network that states have as well. So would you take a moment to comment on how that could have happened, and how, in the instance of our system, it is intended to avoid that? Who wants to start first?
I'll answer, Ms. Jackson Lee. Thank you for the question. The only commonality that comes to mind based on the reporting that I've seen is human error. And human error is still one of the primary drivers for cyber vulnerabilities, whatever system you're looking at. And so we have to continue to address that with additional training, additional acquisition of more skills, bring in more people with those skills, and make sure that we try to diminish the opportunity for human error to occur.
Gentlemen? Please.
Congresswoman Lee, as I think about your question, I think quite a bit about what CDM's trying to do, which is to automate as many processes as possible and try to take the human factor out of the situational analysis around assets, vulnerabilities, configurations, whatever the case may be. So to the extent that if you try to relate one to the other, yes, the incident, as it was reported in the paper, looks like it was a human error. I think there'll always be a human element to what goes on. But CDM as itself, to relate it back, which I think was the premise of your question, to relate it back to what CDM's about, by taking more control from an automated perspective of your environments and being able to do something in a very automated way, I think you start to minimize the impact that the human element might have.
Yes.
Take a slightly
you.
different, slightly different angle, I think. Another part of the CDM program overall scope will be remediation when an issue occurs. There will always be human elements that as you mentioned, that will come into play, and there will always be that cause, and we will continually be adapting to situations such as this. And our ability to remediate or mitigate when an issue does occur, and then put processes in place to prevent it from occurring again and learn those lessons, are as crucial as the automation and processes that we can implement.
So I'm not expert on the incident that happened, but I think a perspective I can give you that might help is what's going on in the private sector to deal with the shortages in human workers and skills and resources and training that's been discussed today. There's two trends that are underway. The private sector is certainly doubling down its investment in software approaches to these problems. And two of those trends are occurring so one I mentioned earlier today about automation orchestration. How do we add as much automation and adaptive capabilities to the system so we're not so dependent on humans? And CDM certainly could benefit from that. On the second trend is the adoption of technologies such as machine learning and data analytics to understand, to help us as practitioners filter through the noise so that only the important signals get through and our human time is spent more efficiently, so that there's less burden on our human resources and less likelihood of an accident or an incident. These technologies are all receiving major investments in the private sector and will continue to in the near future.
It's clearly important because of the large percentage of the infrastructure that is in the private sector. Let me quickly ask this question, if I might. CDM will be the first government-wide effort to centralize the assessment of the cyber health of the federal computer system. And as we well know, it is massive. It is massive, more massive than Hawaii, more massive than another state, or the collective states. It is the federal government impacting so much. How well prepared do you think we are to correctly interpret the information that we will be receiving? Obviously, there's a human element there in receiving and interpreting that information.
So thank you for that question. I think that's a very important question, and it centers around the theme of my testimony today. CDM provides us a visibility of assets within government perimeters. So what's going on inside the network? There are additional programs out there, such as the Einstein program, that provides visibility into what's coming in and out of the network, that perimeter viewpoint. Both of these programs satisfy a very critical and necessary need, but today there is no integration between the data of these two programs. So I think to your question is, how do we increase the value we're getting from these investments? And one of that ways is by allowing DHS and agencies to benefit from tools such as data analytics to fuse some of the information that they're getting from two programs to more effectively enable the mission to hunt for bad actors and identify the techniques and tactics that are used by these actors.
I think it's a roadmap that we need to follow. If I could just, Mr. Chairman, indulge me for Mr. Hodgkins to follow up a question that Mr. Richmond asked. Let me combine a question here. Defending against cyber threats is an ever-changing landscape. Can CDM adjust to the rapid changes in technology and applications? And the question I want to follow up, Mr. Hodgkin and Mr. Richmond, is by teaching our youngsters code. As you well know, there's you may know there's an effort to teach code in minority communities to increase the opportunity. Is that an element of providing for the workforce? Is that a productive use as it relates to this kind of work? But the first question is, are we able to adjust to the rapid changes in technology and applications? And then, is training in code productive?
Thank you for the question. To your first question, yes, I think the program does have the ability to evolve and to position itself as technologies move forward. We've talked about some of that, and my counterparts have also shared some elements of that. So I think that the system and the processes that are being put in place, and as we move into phase 3 and phase 4 and contract for those, we continue to reevaluate what does the environment look like, what is the threats, new threats that perhaps didn't exist when we were contracting for phase 1, how do we incorporate those capabilities, and how do we move forward? So the processes that are put in place to implement through phases CDM will continue to evolve and help the program evolve as well. Our industry has been very strongly supportive, in answer to your question, the second question, of a variety of programs to try and increase the level of interest in STEM activities across the board, and coding in particular. It's essential that we try and get to students early on. There's multitudes of research that have been shown that getting to students early on and securing their interests before other factors come into play and distract them, if you will, from taking a STEM type career path or course path is important. And coding is an element that seems to attract a lot of attention, and get a lot of attention of a lot of younger people who grew up in a computer world as a way that they can interact and build a successful career. So we have been supportive and will continue to be supportive of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, have additional questions that I'd like to submit for the record. Thank you very much to all the witnesses. Thank you for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. That concludes our hearing today. I thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and your insights today. I thank the members for their questions. As indicated, some members of the committee have additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you all to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will remain open for a period of 10 days. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.